I've always loved the little quirks of my property. The old oak trees, the wildflowers in spring, and yes, the tiny creek that cut across the back corner like it was daring me to do something about it. For years, I just walked around it, stepped over it, or complained quietly to myself. But one morning I was sipping coffee on my porch, looking at it, and it hit me. Why not build a bridge, a real bridge? Not a fancy one, just something functional that would let me cross without slipping into the mud every time it rained. I know what you're thinking. A bridge on your own backyard, that sounds complicated. And honestly, yes, it was. But I was feeling adventurous, and something about this small project made me giddy. Like it was mine to create, mine to enjoy. And little did I know, it would also become my first major showdown with the HOA. I started small. I grabbed my old sketchpad and drew what I thought would work. Just a simple wooden span, sturdy enough to walk on with little railings. Of course, measuring turned into a comedy of errors. My first attempt at a plank, way too short. My second, way too long. And somehow one of them ended up in the mud after I tripped over it. I laughed, shook my head, and muttered, "This is going to be harder than I thought." But slowly, things began to take shape. I gathered supplies, made trips to the hardware store, and even had neighbors stopping by to ask what I was up to. Some were supportive. "Looks awesome, can I help?" Others just stared with the kind of skepticism that makes you question your sanity. And then there was Mrs. Peterson, who leaned over the fence with a smirk. "You know, the HOA might have a problem with whatever you're planning there." I froze for a second. The HOA, the dreaded Homeowners Association, a group that exists solely to make your life mildly miserable, usually over things like whether your mailbox is the right shade of brown or if your lawn has exactly 12 dandelions. I tried to laugh it off, pretending I hadn't heard her. But the seed of doubt was planted. Still, I pushed forward. Every nail I hammered in, every plank I laid, it felt like a tiny act of rebellion. There's something oddly satisfying about creating something yourself, especially when it's simple, functional, and frankly, beautiful. By mid-afternoon, the basic framework was up, and I could actually step onto it and feel it hold my weight. My heart swelled. I didn't just see a creek anymore. I saw possibilities. Then came the first real sign of trouble. A white envelope appeared in my mailbox the next morning, marked with the HOA's official seal. I picked it up, felt the weight of bureaucracy in my hands, and opened it with both curiosity and dread. The letter was polite, of course, painfully polite. Something about unapproved structures and community standards, and please rectify the situation immediately. And then the kicker, a fine, $250. $250 for a little bridge on my own property. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. Who finds someone for creativity, for doing something practical, for, well, building a bridge? It felt like they were treating my backyard like it was the Pentagon, and I had just started a construction project without clearance. I sat on the edge of the bridge, staring at the creek, trying to digest it. Part of me was angry, part of me was confused, and part of me couldn't stop laughing at the sheer audacity of it all. But deep down, a spark lit in me, not the kind that makes you give up. The kind that makes you think, okay, this is war, and I'm not losing. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. A $250 fine was just the opening move. What followed would test my patience, creativity, and sanity in ways I never imagined. The HOA had no idea what they were getting into. And I, for one, couldn't wait to show them. After the HOA letter landed on my porch like a tiny paper grenade, I couldn't stop thinking about it. $250 for a bridge on my property. I stared at the little creek behind my house and laughed. Part of me wanted to give in, tear down the partially built frame, and apologize profusely to an organization that probably didn't even know how to build a bridge. But another, louder part of me, the one with a hammer in one hand and stubbornness in the other, was determined to finish what I started. So I built. The first morning, I carried a stack of planks down to the creek and realized immediately that my bridge was going to be more work than I thought. The ground was muddy, the creek was slightly deeper than I remembered, and my boots made that squelchy sound that every adult knows is a warning, danger ahead. My first step onto the frame caused it to wobble in a way that was terrifying and frankly hilarious. I grabbed the nearest plank like a lifeline and muttered, "Okay, maybe not quite perfect yet." Every step of the way, I found myself inventing solutions on the fly. One plank too short, saw it down and hope for the best. Nail bent, twist it, whack it, call it rustic. A branch fell into the creek, instant decoration. I was making a bridge, sure, but I was also building a story. Every mistake, every laugh, every scraped knuckle became part of it. By mid-afternoon, my neighbor Tim stopped by. He leaned on the fence, arms crossed, and gave me that half-amused, half-judgmental look that neighbors always give. "Still working on that bridge, huh?" I grinned, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Yeah, you think the HOA will find me for creativity next?" He chuckled. "I think they already did." Even as I laughed, there was tension bubbling beneath the surface. That $250 fine wasn't just a slap on the wrist, it was a warning shot. The HOA was watching, and I could feel it. Every plank I hammered felt like a small act of defiance, and I knew it. I wondered if any of them had actually seen my bridge yet. Did they drive by slowly, taking notes? Did someone have a clipboard? The thought made me smirk, then shiver a little. Over the next few days, I fell into a rhythm. Mornings were for cutting and measuring, afternoons for hammering and testing, evenings for drinking iced tea on the porch, staring at the slowly forming bridge, and imagining the look on the HOA's face when they finally realized I wasn't stopping. I also began documenting everything. Photos, videos, little notes about the process. Not that I expected to go to war with the HOA, or at least, I didn't until I realized they weren't going to back down quietly. There was a strange satisfaction in it, though. If they wanted a fight, I was going to give them a challenge. One plank at a time. Of course, things weren't all serious and strategic. There were mishaps, of course. One day I dropped a hammer into the creek. It sank immediately with a satisfying plunk, and I spent 15 minutes fishing it out with a stick while cursing like a pirate. Another day, I miscalculated a step and ended up knee-deep in mud. I think the raccoons were laughing at me. And there was the time the cat decided to test the bridge by sprinting across it and almost launching itself into the water. I laughed until my ribs hurt. Yet despite the chaos, the bridge began to take shape. The frame was sturdy, the planks were solid, and even the railings were starting to look professional. Well, professional for a backyard bridge anyway. Standing on it for the first time, I felt a small rush of pride. It wasn't just a crossing over a creek anymore, it was a statement. My statement. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, a knock at the door jolted me. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened it to find the HOA's official letter carrier, or at least, someone holding a thick envelope with that same sterile seal. I accepted it with a forced smile, my heart already racing. I didn't have to open it to know what it said. More warnings, more rules, and that familiar bureaucratic threat lurking beneath the polite words. I closed the door and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. The bridge was nearly finished, and the fine still hung over me like a storm cloud. But instead of fear, I felt something stronger, anticipation. This was going to be a battle, yes, but also an adventure. And as I looked at my almost complete bridge, glinting in the late afternoon sun, I couldn't help but grin. The HOA thought a $250 fine would stop me. They had no idea. And that's when I realized things were only getting started. I had barely finished setting the last plank of the bridge when the HOA letter sat on my kitchen counter like a ticking time bomb. I stared at it, hands hovering over the envelope, wondering if I should rip it open or just throw it in the recycling and pretend it didn't exist. Curiosity won, of course, and with a deep breath, I opened it. The words inside were calm, almost polite. Too polite. Something about unauthorized structures and noncompliance with community guidelines. And then, in bold, the dreaded number, $250, a fine for my bridge that didn't block traffic, didn't harm anyone, and frankly, looked better than half the landscaping in the neighborhood. I sank into the kitchen chair, running a hand through my hair. $250 for this, I muttered to myself. I glanced out the window at the creek, at my creation, and for a moment I just laughed. The absurdity of it all was almost cinematic. A tiny bridge, standing proudly over a little creek, and some bureaucrat thinking it was an act of rebellion against the HOA. But beneath the laughter was a twitch of anger. How dare they? How dare they try to control what I did on my own property? I remembered Mrs. Peterson's smirk from the other day and the faint warning in her voice. Now I understood. The HOA wasn't going to back down. They had drawn their line in the sand, and my bridge was on the wrong side of it. I spent the rest of the day packing, thinking. Options ran through my head. I could tear it down. I could pay the fine, or I could fight. And as I looked at my bridge one more time, I realized there was only one choice. There was no way I was letting a $250 threat scare me off. That evening, I started drafting my response. I wrote emails, took photos, and made little notes about the process. How I built it, the measurements, the materials, the small details that showed it wasn't just a random structure thrown together. I even included shots of the neighbors' kids playing on it, harmless, joyous, innocent. I wanted them to see that this bridge wasn't a problem. It was a little piece of happiness in the neighborhood. The next morning, I got a call. I knew the number before I even looked. "Hello, this is Mr. Thompson from the HOA enforcement team," said a voice that sounded like it had been trained to annoy. "We received your response regarding the unauthorized structure. We will need to schedule an inspection." "An inspection," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's a bridge, not a crime scene." There was a long pause. "Sir, it's our policy." I laughed nervously, realizing this was exactly the challenge I had been waiting for. The first real face-to-face. And I had a feeling this was going to be interesting. 2 days later, an inspector showed up at my property. He carried a clipboard like it was the 10 Commandments, and his expression suggested he believed he was single-handedly saving the community from disaster. I met him at the gate, smiling faintly, my hands in my pockets. "Mr. Johnson," he asked, his voice precise, military even, "we're here to assess the structure." I stepped aside, gesturing toward the bridge. "Of course, please inspect away." He walked across it slowly, like a tightrope walker. He tapped each plank, squinted at the railings, took copious notes. I followed, pretending to be concerned about safety. "Does it seem sturdy?" I asked. He didn't answer, he just scribbled. Halfway through, I noticed his shoulders tense up. Maybe he realized how small, harmless, and dare I say, charming this bridge actually was. I resisted the urge to smile. I had to stay calm. If he saw me gloating, the HOA would sense a challenge. And that's exactly what I wanted. By the end of the inspection, he had a full report typed up on his clipboard. I barely glanced at it, though I caught a few phrases. Structure of concern, potential noncompliance. Recommend action. My heart sank for a second, then I reminded myself, this was still just the first round. The bridge was intact, the kids were happy, and I was ready for whatever came next. As he drove away, I leaned on the railing and watched my bridge glint in the afternoon sun. The battle lines were drawn. The HOA thought this was just a fine. They had no idea it was only the beginning. And I couldn't help but grin. Because now, the real game had started. I knew it was only a matter of time before the HOA decided a phone call wasn't enough. And sure enough, a week after the inspection, I got the email I'd been half expecting, half dreading. A request to meet with their enforcement officer in person. I stared at the message for a long time, holding my coffee like it might give me courage. This is it, I thought, face to face, the real showdown. I spent the next few days preparing. I took extra photos of the bridge, documented every nail, every plank, even the angle of the sunlight on the creek just for fun. I rehearsed what I'd say, how I'd stay calm, and how I'd, subtly, assert that this bridge was not a threat to the community or civilization itself. Finally, the day came. I walked into the HOA office, the kind of building that somehow manages to feel simultaneously bureaucratic and cold. A receptionist gave me a clipboard and a polite smile, like I was here for a routine survey instead of a duel of wills. Then I met him, Mr. Thompson, the enforcement officer. He was tall, lean, and had the kind of perfectly smug expression you only see in sitcom villains. He didn't shake my hand. Instead, he tilted his head, clipboard in hand, and said, "Mr. Johnson, let's discuss the unauthorized structure on your property." I smiled, keeping it calm. Yes, the bridge. I take full responsibility for it being impressive. He didn't smile back. He launched into what I can only describe as a monologue of rules, regulations, and HOA bylaws, all delivered with the same tone someone might use to explain quantum physics to a kindergartner. I nodded politely, trying not to laugh at how absurd it all sounded. At one point, he held up a form with one of those bolded non-compliance stamps. "This structure violates Section 17B of the Community Standards. You are in breach, and we require immediate action." I leaned back in my chair, trying to appear calm while my mind raced. Immediate action? Were they seriously expecting me to tear down a bridge I had spent weeks building, just because someone somewhere decided a creek crossing was offensive? I decided to throw them off balance with humor. "Section 17B, huh? Did they happen to specify a maximum fun factor?" I asked lightly. He didn't react. Not a twitch. I realized then that humor might not work, but patience and strategy could. I spent the next half hour calmly explaining my case. The bridge wasn't dangerous, it wasn't blocking anything, and I had neighbor support. I even showed photos of kids playing safely on it. I could see Mr. Thompson's pen hovering over his clipboard, indecision creeping in. He didn't like losing control, and I didn't like being intimidated. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. I asked about local building codes and property rights. I pointed out that while the HOA had guidelines, there was nothing in the law prohibiting a small bridge on my property. His face twitched, just slightly, but I could tell it hit a nerve. "You understand," he said finally, "that if you do not comply, we can escalate this to a formal hearing and additional fines may apply." I leaned forward. "I understand, and I'm prepared to defend my bridge if it comes to that. But I also hope you'll agree this isn't exactly a neighborhood threat. It's a bridge." He didn't respond. He just scribbled on his clipboard, the tension in the room so thick I could almost taste it. We stared at each other for a long moment, neither of us blinking. Then, with a small, barely perceptible sigh, he said, "We will review your materials further." I nodded, keeping my calm smile, trying not to let my satisfaction show. The bridge had survived this round. But I knew the battle was far from over. They were regrouping, plotting their next move, and I had to be ready. As I walked back to my car, I glanced over my shoulder at the office, imagining them flipping through my photos, muttering about nails, planks, and children playing safely. I couldn't help but chuckle. Because deep down, I knew one thing. I wasn't just building a bridge over a creek. I was building one over absurdity, over bureaucracy, and over every unnecessary fine they tried to throw at me. And I wasn't done yet. After the confrontation at the HOA office, I realized something important. The battle wasn't just about rules or fines anymore. It was about perception. About showing them that this little bridge wasn't a threat, it was a part of life. And if they thought a $250 fine would scare me off, they were in for a surprise. So I decided to take action. Not the kind that tears things down, but the kind that forces them to see things from my side. I started small. I posted photos of the bridge online in our neighborhood group. No dramatic captions, just images of the creek, the bridge, kids crossing safely, even Mrs. Peterson's dog posing on it. The responses surprised me. People loved it. Suddenly, my bridge wasn't just mine. It was the community. The next morning, I heard the faint hum of a lawnmower and realized that even the neighbors were getting involved. One by one, they came to check on the bridge, offer advice, and even help with minor tweaks. Tim brought extra screws, Mrs. Peterson offered to paint a little "Welcome to the Bridge" sign, and a couple of kids brought tiny toy boats to float in the creek. It was chaotic, a little messy, and completely perfect. Meanwhile, I knew the HOA wasn't going to sit quietly. Their emails became more frequent, their language more formal. Immediate action required, potential violation, community standards. They were flustered, and I loved it. They wanted to intimidate me with bureaucracy. I was countering with laughter, community, and a solid wooden bridge. One afternoon, as I tightened the final railing, I heard a honk. I looked up to see the HOA inspector from last week parked across the street, clipboard in hand, just watching. I waved casually, pretending I didn't notice him taking notes or whispering into his phone. I could see the wheels turning in his head. This wasn't going according to their plan. They were used to people panicking, tearing down whatever minor offense they deemed unacceptable. But I wasn't panicking. I began documenting everything even more carefully. Photos, videos, progress updates. I wanted a record of my bridge, of my neighbors' support, and of every step I took legally and safely. It was my insurance against their next move, and it felt empowering. Each picture was a little victory, each video a statement. This is harmless, this is fun, and we're not stopping. But humor became my secret weapon too. I started small, playful things. I hung a tiny sign that read, "Bridge Patrol, all welcome," and jokingly told the kids to check in before crossing. I made a short video pretending the bridge had a toll, complete with imaginary coins and a cardboard box. The neighbors loved it. Even Tim laughed until he cried, and Mrs. Peterson insisted on posing on it like a queen on her throne. The bridge was no longer just wood and nails, it was a story. A narrative the HOA couldn't control. Yet behind the laughter, I knew tension was building. The HOA was probably furious, strategizing their next move. I could feel it in their emails, in the vague hints of inspections, and in the whispers I sometimes caught when walking past the office. They wanted control. They wanted compliance. And I wasn't giving it. Late one evening, I sat on the bridge with a cold soda, looking at the creek reflecting the last bits of sunlight. I thought about how this had started as a simple idea, a bridge to cross a creek. And now it had become a battle of wills, a small war fought with humor, persistence, and community spirit. I grinned, imagining the HOA reading my latest updates, muttering, "What is happening here?" But I knew better than to get complacent. This was only the beginning. They might escalate further: inspectors, fines, maybe even a formal hearing. But I was ready. I had allies, evidence, and a bridge that symbolized more than wood and nails. It symbolized resilience. As I stood up and dusted off my jeans, I whispered to myself, "Bring it on." The bridge wasn't just a crossing anymore. It was my statement, my little fortress against nonsense. My way of showing that $250 fines couldn't intimidate someone who refused to back down. And somewhere, I imagined, the HOA was already scrambling, wondering how a simple bridge had turned into this much chaos. Little did they know, I had more tricks up my sleeve. I should have known that after my little counterattack, the HOA wouldn't sit quietly. Their patience, or what passed for patience, was wearing thin, and I could feel it in the tension rising with every email, every message, every vague warning about further action. They were clearly scrambling, trying to figure out how to deal with a bridge that refused to be tamed. It all came to a head one Saturday morning. I was sipping coffee on my porch, enjoying the calm, when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I glanced up and froze. A white SUV with the HOA logo slowly pulled into my driveway. My heart skipped a beat. There were two men in the back seat, clipboards in hand, looking serious in that, were the law of this cul-de-sac way. They stepped out, straight-faced, and I realized that this wasn't just a friendly visit. This was a full-on inspection. I walked over, trying to appear casual, even cheerful. "Morning, here to see the bridge." One of them didn't smile, the other scribbled on his clipboard without looking up. "Yes, we're here to assess compliance. Please allow us access." I led them to the bridge, trying not to smirk. The sun glinted off the planks, the creek sparkled below, and the neighborhood kids waved from a safe distance. I could almost hear the universe laughing along with me. Bureaucracy versus a wooden bridge. They began their inspection methodically. Tap, tap, squint right. Tap, tap, squint right. Every action was meticulous, almost ritualistic. I stood to the side, arms crossed, feigning anxiety while secretly savoring every moment. It was like watching a live-action board game where the HOA was the piece you were meant to crush. After a few minutes, the tension in the air became almost tangible. I could tell they were flustered. Every time a kid ran across the bridge or a neighbor waved from the fence, their pen paused mid-scribble. They were not expecting the bridge to be lively and harmless and fully functional. At one point, the older inspector bent down, poked at a plank, and muttered something I couldn't quite hear. I smiled politely, careful not to react too much. Their own confusion was almost satisfying to watch. They were used to people panicking at the threat of fines. They were not used to someone calmly hosting a neighborhood bridge festival in the middle of a supposed violation. After what felt like an eternity, they finally retreated to the edge of the creek to confer. I couldn't hear the words, but their body language was priceless. Head shaking, pens tapping, a faint muttering that suggested something like, "This isn't going according to plan." I used the moment to document everything. My phone captured video of the inspection, of kids skipping across the bridge, of Mrs. Peterson holding her dog on the railing. Every clip was evidence. The bridge was safe, loved, and entirely harmless. If the HOA tried to escalate, I was prepared. By the time they left, scrutinizing every corner of the property on their way out, they hadn't issued a citation. They didn't even mention the $250 fine. I closed the gate behind them, took a deep breath, and let out a laugh that echoed across the creek. Victory for now. But I knew this was only temporary. The HOA was likely regrouping even as I celebrated. They would be plotting, strategizing, looking for ways to reclaim authority. The emails would come, the letters would come, and maybe even a formal hearing. And I had to be ready. I spent the rest of the afternoon reinforcing the bridge, tightening railings, and double-checking every plank. I even added a small decorative sign that read, "Bridge, tested and approved by neighbors." Purely symbolic, but it made me smile every time I saw it. Humor, after all, was my best weapon. That evening, I sat on the bridge, letting the water shimmer beneath me, and I realized something important. This bridge wasn't just a way to cross a creek anymore. It was a statement. A rebellion disguised as wood and nails. A proof that sometimes stubbornness, humor, and a little creativity could outmatch bureaucracy. I sipped my coffee, thinking ahead. The HOA would return, they would escalate further, but I was ready. I had evidence, community support, and a bridge that refused to be intimidated. And deep down, I couldn't help but grin at the thought of their faces when they realized they were no longer in control. Because in the game of rules versus reality, sometimes reality wins. And my bridge, it was winning. It all came to a head on a Tuesday morning. I had been expecting this day ever since the HOA inspection escalated to a full-blown war of wills. I opened my front door and saw the familiar white SUV parked in my driveway. My stomach did that little flip. It's the here comes trouble feeling, but this time I wasn't scared. I was ready. Two officers stepped out, clipboards in hand, looking like they were about to declare martial law on my backyard. I took a deep breath, adjusted my hat, and walked toward them with a smile that I hoped was more intimidating than it looked. "Good morning," I said cheerfully. "Here for the bridge inspection, I assume." They didn't smile. One of them gave a curt nod, the other just stared. I could see the tension in their shoulders, the subtle signs that they were aware I wasn't going to back down. We walked to the bridge. I had taken extra care the night before, every plank secure, every nail polished, even the tiny bridge approved by neighbors sign shining proudly in the sunlight. Kids from the neighborhood waved at the inspectors from a safe distance, and I swear I could see a flicker of frustration cross their faces. The first officer cleared his throat and began his usual spiel about compliance, rules, and potential fines. I listened carefully, nodding in all the right places, my mind racing with strategy. I knew this was my moment. One wrong move and they could try to intimidate me into giving up. But I had prepared. I had evidence, support, and confidence on my side. When they finished, I calmly presented my documentation. Photos of the bridge at every stage of construction. videos of kids, pets, and neighbors enjoying it safely, copies of local codes showing that the structure was legal. I even included a small note from Mrs. Peterson, stating that she fully supported the bridge and found it charming. I could see the first officer scribbling notes, his pen hesitating as if unsure what to write. The second officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing that they had underestimated me. Then I did something subtle but powerful. I stepped aside and let them look at the bridge again, this time with no interruptions. Sunlight glinted off the wood. The creek sparkled beneath it. A group of kids played nearby, laughing. The bridge wasn't just functional, it was beautiful, practical, and beloved. It was undeniable. I spoke softly, almost casually, but every word carried weight. This bridge isn't a violation. It's part of the property, it's safe, it's legal, and the community appreciates it. You can cite me, fine me, or send more inspectors, but the facts don't change. This bridge exists, and it's doing exactly what it was meant to do. There was a long pause. The kind of pause that stretches on, thick with tension, where you can feel someone's confidence wavering. I held their gaze, keeping calm, letting the evidence speak louder than words. I could see it, the flicker of doubt, the realization that this wasn't going to be as simple as they thought. Finally, the first officer sighed and muttered something under his breath. "We will review this again with the board," he said. His voice lacked its usual certainty. The second officer just nodded, staring at the bridge like it had grown in the yard overnight. I smiled politely. "Thank you for coming. I look forward to your decision." As they drove away, I leaned against the railing of the bridge, feeling the wood beneath my hands. It had survived inspections, bureaucracy, and a $250 fine attempt. The neighborhood kids ran past, laughing, and Mrs. Peterson waved, holding her dog like a tiny victory flag. In that moment, I realized something important. The bridge wasn't just a crossing over a creek anymore. It was a crossing over absurdity, over intimidation, and over unnecessary rules. It had become a symbol of persistence, humor, and resilience. I knew the HOA would probably regroup, but I had won this round. I had defended my bridge, protected my property, and maintained my sanity. And the best part, I hadn't lost my sense of humor along the way. As I stood there, watching sunlight ripple across the creek, I couldn't help but laugh quietly. The HOA had underestimated me. They had assumed that bureaucracy alone could intimidate someone with determination, but the bridge had shown them otherwise. I whispered to myself, "This isn't over, but for now the bridge stands." And for the first time in weeks, I felt a calm satisfaction. The real showdown might be over, but the victory, my bridge, my stubborn little triumph, was mine. The days after the showdown were almost surreal. I checked my mailbox with the kind of cautious anticipation usually reserved for lottery tickets or mysterious letters from long-lost relatives. But this time, it wasn't suspenseful because of fear. It was suspenseful because I was finally going to see if all my planning, documenting, and stubbornness had paid off. Then it came, a letter from the HOA board. I tore it open, heart racing, and read the words slowly, savoring every phrase. The fine was rescinded. No additional actions would be taken. My bridge was officially allowed to remain on my property. Every plank, every nail, every small decorative sign approved, by default if not by sentiment. I laughed aloud, the kind of laugh that bubbles up when you've been holding tension for weeks. Relief, triumph, and a little bit of disbelief mingled together. The bridge wasn't just a structure anymore, it was a symbol. A symbol of patience, strategy, and the fact that sometimes you can win against ridiculous bureaucracy without losing your sense of humor. I stepped outside and looked at it. Sunlight shimmered off the water beneath, the neighbors' kids ran across it, laughing, and even Mrs. Peterson waved from her yard, dog in arms. My hands itched to run along the railing, to feel the wood beneath my fingers, and know that it had survived more than just the elements. It had survived a battle of wills. Of course, victory wasn't just about the bridge itself. It was about what it represented. The HOA had tried to scare me into submission with a $250 fine and warnings about community standards. but I had stood my ground. I had documented everything, rallied support, and used humor as a shield. And in the end, the absurdity of their attempts couldn't match the reality of a well-built, loved, and safe bridge. The neighborhood seemed to sense it too. Conversations shifted subtly, smiles grew wider, and I started noticing little things. Other neighbors pointing out how the bridge made the creek easier to cross, or joking about adding a tiny toll booth for bridge tax collection. The bridge had become part of the fabric of the community, in a way the HOA could never control. Of course, I kept my sense of humor about the whole ordeal. I even printed a small certificate and tacked it to the side of the bridge. Bridge, resilient, legal, and beloved by the community. The kids laughed when they saw it, neighbors smiled, and I felt a quiet, personal satisfaction knowing that every nail, every plank, every minor scrape and mishap had led to this moment. But there was a lesson too, and it wasn't lost on me. Bureaucracy can be frustrating, rules can feel arbitrary, and fines can feel like a tax. But with patience, preparation, creativity, and a little humor, even the most absurd challenges can be met, and sometimes even turned into victories. The bridge wasn't just mine. It was a triumph over nonsense, a small but meaningful victory for anyone who's ever faced unreasonable obstacles. That evening, I sat on the bridge with a cold drink, watching the creek reflect the last light of the sun. A cool breeze rustled the trees, and the neighborhood kids played nearby, shouting and laughing. I leaned back against the railing and let myself savor the moment. The HOA would probably think twice before trying something like this again, and I didn't mind if they didn't fully understand why. As I watched the bridge stand strong, I realized it wasn't just about a creek or a fine or even the HOA. It was about persistence, confidence, and refusing to let petty bureaucracy steal a little joy from your life. I smiled at the absurdity of the whole journey, from sketching the first plank to facing down inspections, fines, and rigid officers. And in that moment, I knew the bridge would remain, not just as wood and nails over water, but as a reminder that humor, cleverness, and a little stubbornness can triumph over red tape. The $250 fine was gone, but the story and the lesson would stay. I took a deep breath, letting the satisfaction settle in. My bridge had survived bureaucracy, inspections, and absurd rules, and it wasn't going anywhere. I had built more than a bridge that day. I had built a story, a small victory in a chaotic world. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I whispered quietly to the creek, to the bridge, and maybe even to the HOA if they were listening. You can try, but sometimes you just can't stop what's rightfully yours. And for the first time in weeks, I felt completely, utterly victorious. Every HOA has a story on HOA headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.